Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. I think it's been a while since I wore the MacArthur shirt. All right, we're back with some more simple history. This video caught my eye from a couple days ago. It's called Hitler's Jewish Soldier. What? How could that be? I guess we'll find out. Original video, link down below. Make sure you're always supporting simple history. Check out the new original content channel, Mr. Terry's History Originals. Link down below. Let's get started.
This soldier, he's the perfect Aryan, one of man's elite warriors. Blue-eyed, steel-jawed, the perfect example of racial superiority. One who will carry the banner of National Socialism into the racially pure future.
You saying Judaism isn't just an ethnicity? It's not just a race of some kind? There's a religious element?
Oh yeah, and he was Jewish, sort of. Well, look, it's complicated. All right, so everyone is aware of Hitler and Nazi Germany's obsession with racial purity.
By the way, the distinction of like the Jewish person and somebody who like practices the Jewish faith has been something that has been analyzed in that way, a lot of it in a more modern sense, separating like an ethnicity or this idea of like a racial group and like a religious practice be seen as different things. Now, at the Nazi Party, they moved towards the racial part of it. But again, remember that the modern conception of race is also something that only goes back at like maybe a century or two. There were so many other elements for identifying, I guess, people. But yeah, with the Nazis, I mean, you didn't have to be like a practicing Jew. No, it was seen as an ethnic thing. Remember, it was based on a racial hierarchy, their whole philosophy.
The belief in the superiority of the Aryan over other ethnicities. But what does this actually mean, and how did the so-called racially impure end up working in the Nazi war machine? First of all, who or what is an Aryan?
Oh, all you Hindu Indian nationalists are about to be pissed. They hate this. Here we go. You'll see.
Aryan was what various ancient, way long ago settlers called themselves in what is now Iran and northern India.
You see that arrow creeping into India? Hindu nationalists today say that never happened. Now, they'll bring up a lot of pseudoscience and stuff to say that's not the case, but whatever. When you hear that, you're probably going to see it in the comments right now.
But then only about 150 years ago, some Germans believed that they were descendants of these ancient settlers, speculating Aryans were some sort of great conquerors who were the reason civilization was brought to Europe.
By the way, the Nazis did not invent that idea. It was basically a German mythology. And a lot of the history around Aryans is very, very suspect from the historical record. We see some of the trace of them going towards Southern Asia. You can see the linguistics. You could see that sort of heritage. But as a nomadic people, leaving behind a weak amount of evidence outside of where we see like Sanskrit going down to Southern Asia, the history is very debatable. But the DNA and linguistic stuff that we have found in certain areas points in that direction.
Some sort of great conquerors who were the reason civilization was brought to Europe. This false idea was combined with their own distorted misunderstandings of Darwinism, for Darwin believed we all have a shared ancestry. When the Nazis took power in Germany in the 1930s, they applied their ideas to the imagined races of the world.
Right, a very bastardized version for sure. Now remember, they were dealing on especially early Darwinian stuff that was already changing by the time that, the Nazis came into power. And it's changed significantly since.
To keep it brief, and to simplify something as complex as this subject, they believed that the Aryans were superior and therefore had a right, if not a duty, to eliminate or subjugate other imagined races. Of course, there was a special hatred for Jews, but this superiority also applied to Roma people, Black and Asian populations, as well as other European groups.
Now, again, one of the big differences is, they felt a lot of those groups were, subhuman almost. One of the difference with their concerns about Jews was not just this racial idea, but also their incredible amount of success across the world, business, entertainment, all types of different institutions, which they were able to tie into the idea of conspiracies.
Like the Slavs. It was believed that these supposedly inferior groups could be identified by arbitrary things like skin color, as well as very specific physical characteristics like skull, nose, or jawline size and shape. While
they had a whole thing of race science back in the day. We ended up finding out there's not a lot of truth to it, but yeah, they'll like measure the nose and the cranium size and all this. Try to make race like a science.
While ignoring other body parts they had in common. The perfect Aryan was tall, had the perfect bone structure, light skin, and was idealized to have blonde hair and blue eyes.
That's why they loved, the Nordic folks. You know what Hitler loved is the Icelanders. They tried to make a good like deal with them, try to get them on their side when Iceland was like, yeah, we want nothing to do with you guys.
Bone structure, light skin, and was idealized to have blonde hair and blue eyes, features that were plastered all over German propaganda. There's a bit of a problem with this, though. Most Germans didn't have blue eyes and blonde hair, which included none other than Hitler himself. So were these dark-haired and brown-eyed Germans somehow inferior? Not at all. The Nordic stereotype of blue...
They were tying nationalism to race, that race was tied to your national identity. That becomes different because, a nation state, especially something as vast as Germany was, which was an empire. Thank you, Otto von Bismarck. But let's also remember that Adolf Hitler was raised in Austria-Hungary, which was a more multi-ethnic empire that he believed was full of these lower races of individuals, and criticized the Habsburg monarchy for being as multicultural as they were, basically saying they weren't racist enough. It's all over Mein Kampf, by the way.
Somehow inferior? Not at all. The Nordic stereotype of blue eyes and blonde hair was an ideal, but not in any way the only acceptable characteristics.
Right.
It was a sign of racial superiority, but not the only factor. No one was sent to Auschwitz for having brown eyes. That still didn't stop a popular joke from the time that the ideal Aryan was as slim as Goering, as tall as Goebbels, and as blonde as Hitler.
They're all drug addicts, too. Dude, Goering was tripping, man. He's also a big dude. Big dude. I don't know how he fit in planes. I don't know how he, I don't know how he operated in the Luftwaffe. Maybe that's why he had to get out of the plane. So you got to be a big boy. Goering, weird looking, short. Got to have all kinds of insecurity about him. So you find with all those guys, huh?
So it's pretty clear then. According to Nazi racial identity, German and Nordic are superior, other ethnicities inferior, all part of a racial hierarchy that ends with Jews, black people, and Asians at the bottom. If only it was that simple. In practice, this played out.
By the way, the Nuremberg laws, they were identifying, if they're going to identify Jews by like a racial or ethnic origin and not based on religion, they had to use it based on, I guess, DNA in that way. Not the DNA that we think of testing and sending it to ancestry.com, but down to your ancestry. And they, in the Nuremberg laws, it basically had established that if you were like 1/4 of Jewish ethnicity, you were considered a Jew, regardless of your, religious practice or anything like that. So a quarter of you.
If only it was that simple. In practice, this played out in a complex and inconsistent way. For example, there was a disdain for so-called Asiatics. However, during the Second World War, one of Germany's greatest allies was the very Asiatic nation of Japan.
Well, they're also running low on allies. Now, Japan ended up feeling a similar way based off of Asian races. The greater prosperity sphere, that they called about, basically put the Japanese at an ethnic hierarchy over other Asian groups, disguised it as being protectors against Western imperialism, but did that protection by engaging in their own brutal imperialism with a view of others in the Asian sphere as lesser than them. Very similar ideology, guised as anti-imperialism.
Hitler rationalized this by making the Japanese honorary Aryans, contradicting his own ideology. This wasn't the only time the Germans did away with their racial profiling. Of all the groups targeted by the Nazis, none were more vilified than the Jews. Of course, there had to be a definition of who was Jewish, which was codified into law. This is where the term Mischlinge enters the picture, meaning half-caste, mixed, or hybrid.
Oh,
this was the term
before.
Applied to those of Jewish descent. German law classified Mischlings into two categories: first degree, which were those with 2 Jewish grandparents, and second degree, who only had 1. 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents were considered fully Jewish. Conversion to Christianity didn't change the perception of these individuals, and would be treated as Jews even if they were no longer practicing the Jewish faith. Only the conversion of an ancestor as far back in time as a great-grandparent would count towards having proper Aryan blood.
How far that goes back? That goes back so much, right? Oh, in that case, you're getting to like less than a quarter of your makeup that way.
A grandparent would count towards having proper Aryan blood. These Mischlings were treated as second-class citizens, and they faced serious restrictions within German society. Of course, like every other racial policy of the Nazi regime, it was haphazard, contradictory, and sometimes flat-out ignored.
Sure. Remember, like, the Holocaust as it comes out didn't happen out of nowhere. There was a steady disenfranchising of Jewish people from the early 30s all the way up until the early 40s. Started with identifying them and then taking away citizenship rights. It was a slower process, eventually turning to violence with things like Kristallnacht, and then obviously goes much further with the final solution.
For example, many Mischlings were discharged from the Wehrmacht based on their Jewish heritage, or were forced to be demoted to a lower rank. They were also not allowed to join the military later in the war. I
remember these are people that had the same reasons to be nationalistic and like German and proud, but based on a characteristic that is not something you choose, they'd be vilified.
They were also not allowed to join the military later in the war. That said, a significant number managed to stay in their military positions, openly defying the policies.
And that seems crazy because of how, by the end of the war, how difficult it was for them to actually get soldiers. They started basically drafting children. But I mean, by then they had, exported their whole Jewish population.
Or were drafted anyway, in spite of the law, due to bureaucratic confusion. In one incident, a half-Jewish man was drafted. He wrote to the Wehrmacht several times, stating directly that he was not racially pure enough for service. His explanations were ignored, and he was conscripted anyway.
So is he trying to get out of the draft, or he was just trying to like be upfront and say, hey, just so you know, I don't necessarily fit your gene pool that you guys have been talking about.
His explanations were ignored, and he was conscripted anyway. Since things weren't confusing enough, many Mischlings and other non-Aryans were given exemptions from the discrimination laws. They were given German blood certificates, documents that made them full-blooded Germans
honorary
by official decree
citizens.
And would be issued on a case-by-case basis and approved by Hitler. It would
probably like, what skills do you bring to the table? How much you're professing your love for the Fuhrer.
Be made clear, however, that this status was entirely conditional and would be reevaluated at the end of hostilities. Around 2,000 men were given these exemptions, made Aryan by official decree rather than actual blood. In all, it's been estimated by scholar Brian Mark Rigg that up to 150,000 soldiers of partial Jewish descent served in the Wehrmacht during the war.
Wait, how many?
50,000 soldiers. It's been estimated by scholar Brian Mark Rigg that up to 150,000 soldiers of partial Jewish descent served in the Wehrmacht during the war.
I mean, it's like they wouldn't have an army if you tried to wipe out that whole fractions of ethnicities. They wouldn't have an army.
These ranged in rank from lowly foot soldier to high-ranking officer, still serving despite their Jewish heritage, though these figures are still disputed by other scholars. It may be hard to understand why they would fight for a system that discriminated against them and also persecuted their families, even sending blood relatives to the extermination camps.
I mean, there could be such things as self-hating one. That can be a thing. Maybe you buy into it and you just accept it and then go along with it and just be fortunate that you've been accepted for these imperfections it seems you have.
So persecuted their families, even sending blood relatives to the extermination camps. Many Mischlings themselves were conflicted, but continued to serve anyway, their love of their homeland overriding their poor treatment, or for any other reason known only to them. Serving became more difficult in April of 1940 when Hitler decreed that all half-Jews be discharged from the Wehrmacht, though they could.
Now, 1940, that's an interesting context because that is a time when Germany was doing very, very well at that time and seemed unstoppable, right? So once you get to 1941, things start to change a bit, but this was their heyday.
Would stay in the ranks if they applied for and received a German blood certificate. It also took a while for the policy to take effect because of the confusion in the aftermath of the Battle of France, and the real crackdown didn't take significant effect until the late summer. Even then, it was carried out haphazardly, with some officers flat out ignoring the order, or the search for Mischlings consisted of the soldiers signing a sworn statement that they were full-blooded Germans.
Yeah, they'd probably get support from a lot of their fellow soldiers who you just kind of become brothers with in the military, and you don't see each other for that. You know what I mean? It was probably a lot that would probably, I would think, stand up for them if they were trying to be removed from service.
Many Mischlings did this, not out of deception, but because the German racial policies were so complex and convoluted that they thought they really were of German blood. And of course, many simply lied about their ancestry and stayed in their positions. This brings us to the soldier at the beginning of the video. Remember him? Well, he's an actual person. Meet Werner Goldberg. When the war broke out in September 19...
Already, red flag, I'm sure, with the Nazis. Like, Goldberg, that name. A lot had to change their names, have more German-sounding names.
1939, he was a month short of his 20th birthday and had served in the Reich's labor service, and in 1938 joined the German military. He fought in the invasion of Poland, on the border in France, and shortly after the outbreak of hostilities, his photograph was taken by a military photographer. The image was then sold and printed with the caption,
"Oh, wow.
The ideal German soldier."
The irony of it all. Your definitions and your ideology is incoherent.
The ideal German soldier, however, turned out to be a half-Jewish or a Mischling of the first degree. His father was a Jewish man who converted to Christianity, which Werner was unaware of, and therefore had two Jewish grandparents.
Oh, so he didn't even know.
After the April Declaration expelling half-Jews from military service, Goldberg was discharged from the military, where he then worked in his old job in a tailor's shop and managed to get contracts to make uniforms for the German military, which he did for the rest of the war. His prior service didn't shield his family from persecution. In 1942, his father was admitted to the hospital, which was soon raided by the Gestapo. As a Jew, he was then taken to a Jewish hospital in preparation for deportation to Auschwitz. On Christmas Eve, knowing the guards would be drunk or off-duty, Werner walked into the hospital, found his father, then walked out without the guards any wiser. He managed to keep his father out of their hands for the rest of the war, saving...
That was lucky. I mean, if he was on those plans, you would never have heard of this guy ever again.
Any wiser. He managed to keep his father out of their hands for the rest of the war, saving him twice again afterwards. Werner Goldberg's tale has both the pinnacle of Aryan supremacy as well as racial inferiority. Is just one example of the experience of many citizens in the German Third Reich.
Final thoughts. Well, then we see how difficult or nearly impossible it is to build a whole ideology based off of those type of like racial identities, because it's so much more nuanced than that of what you see on a family tree. Right? It takes out so much context, but again, all of the nuances that come with just the makeup of a person culturally, if you want to use whatever racial parameters or whatever that, but it shows how incoherent so much of that thinking is. Anyway, I had learned that, that 100,000 people of, Jewish ancestry was such an interesting thing to hear. I guess I had thought that they had sort of weeded out that, that many people, that there wouldn't be that many people by the time that they start really conscripting into the military. But it showed you that even with the efforts that they had, so much of that would, slip through the cracks or was very hard to actually confirm. But amazing to me that, with that, even if you had these successful soldiers that were willing to fight and willing to die, into the war, that they were still pulling those guys out. And we're willing to sacrifice that help to hold to their messed up ideology. Anyway, what'd you think about this? What do you think this whole message, this story kind of shows us about these type of ideologies? Let me know down below. All right, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.